Hello, everyone, and welcome, including to our visitors and viewers from C-SPAN. I am Jim Kelly, Director of the Gabelli Center of Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this webinar on Lincolnomics with our partners, the Museum of American Finance and the CFA Society of New York. This event is part of our Centennial Series celebrating 100 years of purpose-driven business education at Fordham. It is particularly timely since we are currently offering a course in financial history at Fordham in conjunction with the Museum of American Finance. During the presentation, please enter your questions by typing them in the Q&A section near the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be addressing as many questions as possible after the presentation. Lastly, as a participant in today's webinar, you will be entered into a raffle to win a free ebook of Lincolnomics. Winners will be notified at the end of the week. Now I would like to turn it over to David Cowan, President of the Museum of American Finance, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and it's always great to be back with you, the Gabelli School, our friends at the CFA. And this is the third time I've had the pleasure to introduce John. And the first time I introduced him, he had written 10 books, which I thought was pretty impressive. Well, the second time he was up to 16, and now we're up to 19 books. So congratulations on that, John. And this book is particularly timely because in part of it, he's discussing about infrastructure. As we know, Congress is currently debating an infrastructure bill. And John ponders several times throughout the book, quote unquote, what would Lincoln do? Now, John's prolific writing also includes over 1,000 columns, blogs, and articles in places like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Forbes, and Bloomberg. But most importantly, of course, our own magazine, Financial History, and an article based on the book will be out in the spring issue sometime next month. John has appeared on many media outlets from NBC to NPR, CNN to CNBC, MSNBC to PBS. Now, he's a native of Illinois, and during his childhood, he visited many Lincoln tourist destinations. And he continued on doing that as an adult around the country, visiting various tourist sites. Therefore, when you read the book, there's several great appendices, and one of them is his reviews that I don't want you to miss of the various Lincoln tourist destinations. Now, John, it has been a very difficult 12 or 13 months for this country, so please tell us, what would Lincoln do?
Thank you so much, David, for that generous intro. It's always a pleasure to speak at the Museum of American Finance, and thanks so much to our great sponsors from the Gabelli School of Business, Center for Global Security Analysis, CFA Society of New York, and all of you for attending this Zoom session on what I hope will be a revealing new look at Abraham Lincoln and infrastructure. The story starts in 1828. A young man is taking a flatboat, transporting goods, hogs, agricultural produce from southern Indiana on the Ohio River down the Mississippi to New Orleans. On the way, he discovers two things. He sees that people who are enslaved do not have the same economic opportunity to advance their own station, and it's a moral evil. He also sees the importance of transporting goods to markets and having access to those markets no matter where you live. So if you're a rural farmer wherever in the country, you don't have to go through this labyrinth of what was then the interstate system on the nation's large rivers to get there. This young man was Abraham Lincoln. He took another trip out of Springfield, Illinois. 1828 is a really important year, though, because that's when the Erie Canal opened. That gave New York City, which became, of course, one of the greatest ports in the world, access to the markets west into the Great Lakes, At the time, Chicago wasn't even a city. It was a swampy trading post, um, very inaccessible because the only way of getting down to the Mississippi River was through a ugly portage called Mud Lake, which even in 1673, two explorers, Jolliet and Marquette, Father Marquette, um, said, hey, there should be a canal here, because if you connect the Chicago River to Lake Michigan, the Great Lakes, the Erie Canal, New York City, you can get to New Orleans, because then you can get to the Illinois River and then the Mississippi and on to the Crescent City. So that was one of the first impressions that young Abraham Lincoln had as the nation was growing in the 1830s. It was really a time that we don't really study a whole lot, because we mostly skipped from the Revolution to the Civil War. There was a lot of history in between. One of the reasons I wrote the book, because I wanted to know, how did our country develop? What did we need to do to get to where we are today? And eventually, what do we need to do to get deeper into the future, into the more equitable present? So what was really important about that one trip, it was a very Huckleberry Finn-like trip for Lincoln. It changed his worldview. It changed his thinking. It changed the way he said things in public. One of his first really campaign planks in the 1830s, when he ran for the General Assembly. He's in Springfield, Illinois now, still a young man in his 20s, failed at running 2 stores, tried surveying, was splitting wood, was doing anything to make ends meet. He had some debts. A partner in a store left him high and dry. He had to pay off those debts, and he did all this while being very curious about the world and about markets and economics and things that would transform not only his life, but the life of all rural Americans and even people in cities. So he proposed something very interesting. The first thing he said was that we need to build a canal from Springfield all the way to the Illinois River, which would have facilitated a great new port and a great new access to the markets in New Orleans and further south, and also to create a canal that would later be called the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which would connect Chicago to the Illinois River. It's only about 96 miles. And as a third thing, which actually was poo-pooed at the time because everybody thought it was going to be way too expensive, was a major railroad line to connect the whole state to the rest of the eastern markets at the time. And that railroad was going to be called the Illinois Central. So he worked with a fellow named Stephen Douglas, his great rival throughout life in politics, to get this done. The Illinois legislature passed this massive infrastructure plan and then promptly went bust. It was undercapitalized. The canal had to take some time off because they didn't have the money to hire Irish laborers to to get paid almost nothing to dig it by hand. But that was something that had to be done in order to open up Chicago, the Great Lakes, and the rest of Illinois to global markets. Lincoln saw this early. He campaigned for it, and he was fairly successful in convincing people that this should be done. He wanted to put rural farmers and anybody who wasn't living near a big city or a saltwater port on equal footing with everybody else. How do you do this? Well, you create transportation routes. You build the infrastructure to get people there. So Lincoln was fairly successful as a young assemblyman. But what was more important is that he introduced this concept based on Henry Clay's American system, that if you build infrastructure, it would create economic progress. This was fundamental to the Whig view of the world in the United States. Henry Clay was a Whig, Abraham Lincoln was an early Whig, and they were very much into building infrastructure and tariffs to pay for them, internal tariffs. And they did this at a time when they called it the era of good feelings. I'm never quite sure why they called it that, but the biggest thing at that time was to build canals all over the country to connect these major river systems, which were our interstates then. Of course, railroads took off in the following decade, the 1840s, and then what became this huge interstate system really took off because the canals had seeded the growth. Now, what had happened when Lincoln first proposed his little canal called the Sangamon Canal out of Springfield was that he knew that any place where the canal was at a conjunction with another river system, in this case the Illinois, then a lot of commerce and development would take off. And this is very little known, but he actually was an urban planner. He planned a town at the intersection of this canal called Huron, as in Lake Huron. It, of course, was never built. I saw the plans in doing the research, and something I had never known about Lincoln. And then, of course, he moved on to become a lawyer to make a little bit more money. And he was a very successful lawyer, and he kind of dropped out of politics until 1854. Now, in the interim, America is growing at a rapid pace. The I&M Canal, Illinois-Michigan Canal, opens up 1848. What happens? It creates this major city on the other end of it, Chicago. Chicago, remember, was a dumpy little swampy area right on Lake Michigan. And what it becomes is this major shipping port. It becomes the busiest port in the country when that canal's finished for at least another decade. And by 1900, the population growth is so explosive that it becomes the fastest growing city in the world at the turn of the century. And that was facilitated by this idea that Lincoln championed along with Stephen Douglas. Even more importantly, the Illinois Central Railroad, which really was built to supplement what was going up and down the canals, becomes the longest railroad in the world by 1850. Eventually it goes from the northwest tip of Illinois all the way to New Orleans, but not until after the Civil War, and becomes a major transit route for troop and materiel during the Civil War. So keep those two things in mind. These are two immense developments in the history of the country. The Midwest, links Eastern markets to Western markets to the Southern port. It's globalization in a very small sense, but in a very growing sense. Now, what happens when the Civil War comes along? Well, we know what Lincoln says. We know about the House Divided speech. We know about his Lincoln-Douglas debates. But I started going into some of the material and found something very interesting that he said. Literally in the first debate with Stephen Douglas, Ottawa, Illinois, 1858, he was running for senator at that time against Douglas. Douglas had controlled the Illinois Democratic Party, and at that time, senators were not directly elected. They were elected by state legislatures. So he became the senator. So what happened was that Lincoln, in talking about slavery, made another argument. And this was during the first debate. He said, every man has a right to earn his own bread. And to be on, I'm paraphrasing, to be on an equal footing with everyone. So this is Lincoln's view of economic progress, that you have a right to offer your labor for pay, that you have the opportunity to ascend the economic ladder. And he used those words, economic ladder. How do you move up? How do you avoid being this backwoodsman all your life, doomed to hard scrabble farming? How do you do that? Well, this is part of the American system, the American ethos that we've kind of grown up to learn in our history. But there's more to it than that. Here's something even more exciting. So this is another side plot in the whole Lincoln story, that really during his sort of I wouldn't call it exile, but his estrangement from politics, which lasts roughly from the time he leaves the General Assembly to roughly 1854, when Douglas passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing for expansion of slavery in the Western territories. Lincoln comes to this realization that, what is really important here, other than, ending the evil of slavery is that we still need to pay attention to infrastructure. 1847, his only term in the House of Representatives, he actually gives a very long speech, one of his longest speech ever, on infrastructure. Why is it important to have ports and canals and railroads? What does it mean to the health and the future of the nation? Well, Lincoln thought it was essential. And in fact, he was disparaging President Polk at the time for fighting the Mexican War and neglecting this huge national issue. And keep in mind that up until Lincoln's era, that many of the founding fathers, many Southerners thought that federal funding of infrastructure was unconstitutional. James Monroe himself said in an annual message, even before the canal era, well, I like the idea, we should be building roads and canals and things like that, but it's not in the Constitution. So that was used as an argument against federal funding of infrastructure for decades before the Civil War. So Lincoln's elected, 1860, there's the secession of the southern states. Lincoln has to go into Washington by secret route because there's assassination plot attempts. He gets there and the Civil War starts. Now, in prosecuting the Civil War, Lincoln's record is very well known. But what he had embedded in some of his very basic messages were very foundational ideas on raising all boats through economic progress. Well, what did he favor? Well, first of all, the Transcontinental Railroad. It became a very popular idea in the 1840s. John C. Fremont, who ran for president against Buchanan, campaigned on that. He was one of the first Republicans. Republican Party doesn't come along till the mid 19th century, 1850s. And the new Republican Party, of course, is against slavery and for the Transcontinental Railroad. And Lincoln, having represented the Illinois Central as a lawyer, knew the importance of it. So he favors that, mentions it in one of his annual messages, which were then the State of the Union speeches, and mentions a whole bunch of other things. He is the first president to do a telegraph message, transcontinental. He gets a message from San Francisco, and he loves the telegraph, as we know from history in the Civil War. He spends a lot of time in the telegraph room, getting dispatches from the various battles. First years of the war went very badly for the Union. And of course, Lincoln is shuffling generals. He's trying to get his troops where they need to be. And most of them are the better generals, it turns out, are the railroad engineers who became generals. And they later become active in the Transcontinental Railroad building. So, and here's what's even remarkable. At the height of the Civil War, this god-awful bloodshed, 700,000 people lose their lives. The majority of them lose their lives in the camps to various diseases, typhus and diphtheria and pneumonia. And of course, there's no cure for them, and when they have no idea of what's going on, because the germ theory of disease doesn't come along until like 20, 30 years later. So Lincoln is an early advocate of medical research. He establishes a pathology institute. And I found the papers where he talks about using disinfectants in some of the Union camps. And he doesn't even know about germs. He just hears about it. I saw a letter in the archives where he says, hey, this looks like a really good idea. So he's our innovator in chief. He wants to do new things. He wants to see new ways of communicating, of transporting goods, of getting us to where we need to be. And one of the biggest sort of fell swoops that he signs in the law are three very fundamental laws. The Homestead Act, which allows people basically free land out west. The Morrill Act, which establishes land grant colleges. And of course, the Pacific Railway Acts, two laws actually, which finance and give the land for the Transcontinental Railroad. The following year, that was 1862. The following year, he also passes the National Banking Act. And this is for the first time establishes the greenback, that green dollar that is our national currency, and establishes also an income tax to pay for the war. And during the war, the Union economy actually the GDP increases. It was a very small tax, 3%. They over $800 to pay it. It's a flat tax, but it was the first income tax repealed in 1873, I believe. Then it comes back in 1913. But it was the first way of the national government financing its expenses on that level. So that was a very important development. So all this happens during the Civil War. Of course, the horrible battles, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, also in 1863. And then the war is over. Lincoln loses his life. 1865, he's assassinated at Ford's Theater. But his legacy lives on. And here's the most amazing part of the story is that Lincoln's view of economic progress, that is building infrastructure, raising all boats, really comes out of another part of his psyche. In 1847, he had actually invented a boat. It was a boat that was designed to lift up, not a very big boat, but it would lift it up if it was in shallow waters. And he patented it before he left Washington in 1848 and traveled on the Illinois-Michigan Canal. So Lincoln is the only president who is a patented inventor. So he always had this in the back of his mind, being the innovator in chief. It was like, how do we do things better? How do we use technology? How do we really do the things that we're really good at to make this a better country for everyone? So those are the principal things I discovered. But again, the legacy lives on. He inspired a whole new generation of progressive politicians and thinkers, Frank Lloyd Wright, Jane Addams, social reforms, the Lincoln Highway, which was the first national east-west route, goes from Times Square all the way to San Francisco, was named after him and inspired by him. In fact, I was born just off the Lincoln Highway. The hospital where I was born no longer exists, but it was called the Crossroads of America. And of course, there's Lincoln all over my state, and he's on our license plate. So we have all this inspiration. And then it goes even further. The roads in this country were really terrible, going from one part of the country to another, especially from the Midwest to the West. In 1919, a young colonel named Dwight Eisenhower takes a convoy to explore the state of the roads along the Lincoln Highway from one coast to the other, and comes to the real undeniable conclusion that they're just awful. Some of the routes following the road out of Iowa were just kind of ruts. They're like pioneer trails, and they go through the mountains and the deserts. And from that time on, even into the New Deal era, people were saying, how do we pay for this? How do we do this? Well, the first idea was the Lincoln Highway. So that was 1910, 1913. And the first concept of financing it was that it should be privately financed. So an entrepreneur who was really the heir to the Packard fortune says, we can raise some money to do this. Henry Ford says to him, look, you're not going to do this with private money, and I'm not going to contribute. You're going to need federal funding to do this. So they don't raise enough money. They get some subscribers, including, Woodrow Wilson. Again, I think he gave $5 or something, and it's just terribly underfinanced. And it doesn't really happen until Eisenhower becomes president, 1956, Interstate Highway Act, and creates the largest network of highways on the planet, 40,000 miles plus. I tried to inflation adjust it for today's dollars. It would have been at least $600 billion project. Now we face at least $6 trillion in repairs. Of course, there's proposal for the $2 trillion American Jobs Plan by President Biden, and we're looking at that now. So as with a lot of my stories, and this is like my 5th book on infrastructure, history, finance, telling stories about the people behind these ideas. And the principle here is very powerful, that you do need to make these investments. This is how we link our cities, our towns, our farm fields from coast to coast. And there's a lot of things we need to do. And I'd be happy to take questions on this, but I'll leave you with this one thing. that what we are very good at, that Lincoln really personified, was this idea that innovation would not only lift our economic station, through entrepreneurship, invention, discovery, new technologies, but also lift our spirit. That this is aspirational. We still truly believe that this new invention or this new stock coming on the market or this new idea is going to change the world. And that's what I think makes us Americans. And that's part of the path forward, I think. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, and I have to tell you one last sort of anecdote about it, is that I wrote it backwards. I started out with the COVID era and the pandemic we're in now, and I lost two friends. And I know lots of people who lost friends, and my condolences if you knew somebody who perished in this ugly thing. Um, but it revealed something about us, that we do need to create a better infrastructure, a better social infrastructure, better educational infrastructure, a health infrastructure, as well as the physical infrastructure, better roads, bridges, tunnels, railroads, all these things that come under that huge category of infrastructure. And I can't say enough that building is what we do. And it also builds our spirit and our confidence, and gives us something to hope for. It's aspirational. And with that, I would love to take your questions. And there's there's a whole bunch of stories in the book, and it was a pure joy to write, living in the land of Lincoln. And people ask me, well, how long did it take you to write this? I was like, well, all my life, but this is an ongoing story, and I hope all of you will contribute to this effort to realize what we need to do. And we're back to Jim, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, John. Just to start it off, and let me, before I even ask a question, let me encourage everyone to please enter your own questions in the Q&A box, and we'll keep going on that basis. With the tariff was the main source of income back then, do you think Lincoln would be in favor of higher tariffs today, say on China?
Well, I think that the whole tariff formula proved to be not enough to do what we needed to do in terms of infrastructure. And this was the whole argument during the 19th century. Tariffs were used to fund some infrastructure, but it wasn't enough. Is it a good way to finance these things? I'll leave that to the historians and the financial analysts. I think that, what we do need is a broad-based, sustainable way of financing this, whether it's public-private or through bonds or through carbon tax. There's so many proposals on the table, but we need to get that discussion going, because obviously, if you look at the nation as our house. So if you don't invest in your house, you'll need to paint it, you'll need to replace the heating, the air conditioning, all these things just wear out. And if you don't do that, then you're looking at problems. So, the house is our nation, and it does need to be fixed and upgraded and put in new technology. We need to address climate change, all these things. So we do need, and that is the current argument. How do we do this? How do we finance it?
John, you mentioned in the book, or you just mentioned also innovator in chief. And one of the things related to that, you did mention the patent. I'm wondering if you could expand upon that, because he's, as you say in the book, the only president. And then secondly, a lesser known story, which you bring out, is a dual challenge, believe it or not, that Lincoln had. And just a little bit about that for the audience, because again, most people aren't aware of those two facts.
Well, they're two really good stories, and they both happen different times. But the inventor story was that, for Lincoln to get to Washington, he had to take this god-awful route, through the Great Lakes, through the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River, and sometimes he took the overland routes. And often when he was on a boat in the Great Lakes, it would get stuck on shoals, and they'd have to, pry the boat loose with physical labor. And so he came up with this idea, literally designed it on the ship, where he had these poles. I wish I had a picture of it. Would lift it up, and he had these inflatable buoys that would float the boat up higher. And it was a really clever invention. He made a model of it. He had a friend construct it. It's now in the Smithsonian. It was a beautiful looking craft, not built as far as I know, beyond the model stage, and nobody used it. And besides, in the railroad era, there was probably not that much need for it. The dual challenge was Lincoln had some issues with depression, and he had several courtships. One of his sweethearts died. That was Anne Rutledge in Springfield. Madly in love with her. She dies. He's bereft, and he gets very depressed. And there was Mary Owens before he meets Mary Todd, who is very sprightly, intelligent, politically savvy. Knew Henry Clay, grew up with that whole culture in Louisville, Kentucky, a fellow Kentuckian, and Lincoln was very awkward socially for some reason, unless he was giving a speech, and things didn't go well at first with Mary, and then they broke it off. And he was horribly depressed. And his friend Joshua Speed took away his razor. He wouldn't come out of his bed, and he was just terrible. And somebody insulted him, and there was a duel challenge. And fortunately, 19th century duels were kind of complex affairs. You could apologize, or somebody could broker a peace, and well, that's what happened. So he didn't fight the duel, and that was a good thing. If we lost Lincoln, it would I can't imagine what this country would be like. Good question. Thank you, David.
Okay, John, here's an interesting one. If you could pick one thing to spend infrastructure money on today, what would it be?
That's an easy one for me. It would be healthcare, because one of the things I discovered in sort of writing the book backwards is that there are massive inequities in terms of healthcare coverage between communities of color and the rest of the country. It's very unevenly divided. I mean, I live in a county north of the city where we have a plethora of really good hospitals, but if you go the south side of Chicago, it's not the case. They're struggling to keep hospitals open. So I would spend the money and say, look, how do we have a broad-based plan so that everybody gets, really decent basic health care? I don't know if that's a national health care system or if it's Medicare for all, but we need to come up with something. I mean, the COVID crisis really exposed a lot of these inequities, and it was horrible because some people didn't have access to health care, or they didn't go into the hospital because they were afraid they couldn't pay for it. So this is part of my social infrastructure argument that I think Lincoln would have embraced. Because, and I even go as far as invoking the 14th Amendment, which was inspired by him, the Equal Treatment Clause, saying, hey, at the very least in this country, we should treat everybody fairly and equally. Of course, they haven't been, but I think that's something we need to talk about when we talk about infrastructure.
Very good.
John, Leo Schmidt would like to know, would Lincoln be in favor of a line item veto in order to keep pork belly financing out of infrastructure bills?
I don't think that he would have looked at that specifically, because he was kind of a big picture thinker. So he, Transcontinental Railroad, how big of a project was that? And of course, when you look at history as like, well, God, it's spawned the robber baron era and on all this waste and displacement of Native Americans and murdering them and putting them on reservations. I mean, there are a lot of bad things that happen because of expansionist economic policies, no doubt about it. But how can you see that? And I don't know what he would have thought, to be honest with you, about a line item veto. The question during his time wasn't necessarily government waste. It was government not spending enough money on the things that mattered to the greatest number of people. So that's a tough one, and I'm gonna really pass on that. But I think he would have looked at it eventually. He was very open-minded to new ideas.
Okay, John, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass knew each other well. Please tell us about their rapport and how their relationship impacted Lincoln's values and policies.
Well, in modern parlance, I think they would have been frenemies. So Lincoln was the first president I could tell who welcomed uh, Douglas into the White House. Douglas was, of course, a very accomplished thinker, speaker, abolitionist. I mean, he wrote 2 autobiographies, and you read him, he's amazing. He just opens up the whole issue of slavery and economic equality and what we need to do. I mean, there's probably no better person if you want to understand where we're at today than to read Frederick Douglass. There's also a really good biography out on him right now. Um, so, but Douglas was very critical of Lincoln in the early years, even though they talked on what we would consider to be a fairly regular basis, and he was in the White House, and Lincoln welcomed him in. Douglas didn't think that Lincoln was doing enough to end slavery. Of course, Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in totality, and it was an incomplete declaration that mostly freed slaves to fight for the Union side. So that's one interpretation. In all the pieces that needed to follow, equal education and funding infrastructure for every community, that would come later. But actually, Douglas lived into the 1880s and pretty much was advocating for equal rights. He was at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, as a matter of fact. And I think that in the end, he agreed that Lincoln had done more than any other president to advance the issue of equality and ending slavery. And I don't think too many historians are going to disagree with that. And of course, inspired the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and of course, the great civil rights legislation of the 60s. But I think both men would agree that there's more work that needs to be done.
Here's a different kind of question for you. How would Lincoln convince folks that broadband is the new canal system?
Well, I don't think he would hesitate in doing it, David. And this is why. So when he received and sent the first telegraph message by a president, so Morse had been peddling his invention since the 1840s. And he was really struggling to convince people, like, hey, this is global communications, folks. This is, instead of like Pony Express and putting something on a packet boat and the slow route, you're sending messages at the speed of light. And this was a quantum leap, and Lincoln just loved the idea. And there's all these accounts of him being in the telegraph room in the White House, receiving and sending messages. And it was something I think he would have wholeheartedly embraced. Broadband everywhere, so we can all be hooked up to the same network, the same system, travel, globally at the speed of light. I think he would have loved the idea.
Okay, we got some good questions coming in. Keep them coming, please. Here's one. I'm wondering what Lincoln's actions on education were, and if any of his ideas would apply today to help fix inequality.
Well, here's a great backstory. So the Morrill Act, which he signed in 1862, establishes land-grant colleges, the state universities that we know today. The first iteration just really set aside 30,000 acres per state. The state could do anything they wanted. They could sell it. They could farm it. They could produce income from it. And that was the concept of the land grant. It wasn't a direct subsidy as we know today. And it was the principal means in the 19th century for doing something big, because the federal government really didn't have the income, for one thing. And of course, there was the states' rights argument that states should be doing this first. Well, states just didn't have the ability to raise the capital. And, a lot of the investment that went into these things was foreign investment, especially Transcontinental Railroad, like the Illinois Central. So education, Lincoln, I discovered, was so focused on education because of his own shortfalls in that area. He only had about a year of formal education, and the rest was self-learned. He learned the law on his own, and he became a lawyer, and he studied, and he was a great reader of all sorts of history. He also read Euclid, so he was into math. in all sorts of subjects that I never knew that he read. So he would have embraced the idea of expanding um, the educational system. And the Morrill Act was just one of many. There were several other sort of extensions of that that went into the 20th century that established universities. Historically black colleges came out of that. Um, Native American colleges came out of that in subsequent iterations, which I think he would have loved. But the real backstory is even more interesting than that. Justin Morrill, the Vermont senator who had his name attached to it, originally proposed land grant universities, really inspired by an idea by Jonathan Baldwin Turner, who knew Lincoln as a young man and had proposed this whole idea of the land grant, what he called the industrial university, which would be teaching two basic things, agriculture and what they called the mechanical arts, which became engineering. So he had this idea for decades and pretty much passed it on to Morrill, who actually tried to get it passed in 1858. Buchanan vetoed it, and then it became law under Lincoln. But Lincoln was very well aware of Turner. He had him as a visitor at the White House during the Civil War. Turner was a very famous abolitionist. Ironically, in the same town where Stephen Douglas got his start, Jacksonville, Illinois. So he was kind of the father of the Morrill Act, and what we call, the state college systems, engineering schools, things like that.
We have a what if question for you. What do you believe President Lincoln would have achieved if he had been able to serve out his second term?
Well, I think that's one of our most essential questions to ask today. The low-hanging fruit for me is that he would have completed Reconstruction, and had he lived even longer, he wouldn't have abandoned it in 1870s. And then that, of course, led to the horrible Jim Crow era and lynchings and some really really awful times in our history. So Lincoln would have followed through. He would have witnessed the passage, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and he would have taken it a step further. He would have ensured that there was political equality, complete voting rights, and we generally credit him for being the inspiration of the Great Society programs, the civil rights laws of the 60s. So I think he would have been able to see that through and add to it. He was definitely the soul of all those laws.
John, I'm curious, how would you explain or interpret the transition between the canal system and the rail system? How long did that take, and what were the the stages of development?
Well, that's a really fascinating question, Jim, and it didn't really take long in terms of history, because what needed to happen for railroads to take off is they had to mass produce rail. They had to cut a lot of trees to build the ties. They had to create the technology to extend rail over long distances. And with that came improvements in the steam engine, braking systems. And a lot of this business was centered in Chicago. And one of the kind of ironic facts of history is that the Pullman Car Company was one of Chicago's biggest industries, from its inception. And they literally had to build all these cars out of wood. Lincoln traveled in Pullman cars, and his son, Robert Lincoln, who became a lawyer, was president of the Pullman Company for a while. And there was a horrible Pullman strike there. So that was an important part. So with every one of these stories, there's incremental advances in history. How do you build a better rail that's going to be durable in all conditions? How do you make better steel? How do you make better iron? A lot of this happened, in the steel mills of Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, where you had all these things that really contributed to the advancement of one technology. So we go from the canal era, which was basically 1830s, 1840s. Rail starts to take off because they can mass produce, railroad cars and engines and ties and the spikes. And when the Golden Spike is driven into the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, a lot of interesting things happened. They had to reinvent how they built bridges. Before the Iron Era, most bridges were made out of wood. In fact, here's one great story that I had in the book. Lincoln was defending a company that had built a bridge across the Mississippi River at Rock Island, Illinois. And the railroad, of course, needed to get across the river. And at that time, this is right at the end of the steamboat era. So the whole steamboat industry thought they owned the river. They had a right to this river, and no upstart technology like railroads going to cross their river, right? So there was this incident where a steamboat either crashed or lost control and hit this bridge. And since the bridge was made of wood, it burned to the ground. So the steamboat owner, who had underinsured his ship, sues the bridge company. And they bring on Lincoln as an attorney to represent the bridge company. And he makes this really interesting argument. He doesn't win that case. It ends in a hung jury, but eventually it's won. And he makes this really compelling statement as like, look, this is just not a bridge. This is not an impediment to commerce or trade or anything. This is a public amenity. This links, Chicago, the East, the rest of the country across the Mississippi. And we need to build more of these things, and they belong to the public. They don't, they're not stopping commerce. They're not stopping people from discovering land in the West. We need it. So that was a real important case. It was called the F.E. Afton case. I wrote a whole chapter on it, and I was just fascinated about how Lincoln constructed this argument about the public good of infrastructure.
John, H.R. 40 is in front of, or possibly in front of Congress, dealing with reparations for descendants of slaves. What would Lincoln think about it?
I think he would think about it thoughtfully, and it's a complex subject, and I really think that we need to address the inequities in all of our systems, in education and healthcare, in the fact that there's an environmental justice issue that a lot of toxic plants and refineries have been built in communities of color. I mean, there's a whole raft of things that I think Lincoln would have fundamentally addressed, because it really spoke to his sense of fairness and the idea that equality is truly based on your ability to take advantage of an opportunity. And if somehow you're held back for whatever reason, it should be addressed. So I think he would have discussed it. I think he would have talked to Frederick Douglass about it. Had he lived, he would have talked to Booker T. Washington and all the people who are talking about it today. I even think that he would have taken a hard look at, how do we do this?
One finance specific question, John. How were the canals financed, publicly or privately, and also the railroads? I know there was a lot of speculation in the stock markets, but can you explain how that this whole process was financed?
Well, this is one of the interesting stories of American finance, is that when, for example, the state of Illinois financed the Illinois-Michigan Canal, it floated some bonds, which were horribly inadequate to pay for this. So what they did is they said, okay, we're going to award contracts to private contractors who can hire their own workers to build small sections of the canal, which you're thinking, in management theory, probably not a good idea. And, today's age, you hire one contractor, you put the contract out for bid, the best bidder gets the job. Well, anyway, they would, they'd send notices out to Ireland and other countries in Europe saying, hey, you want to, they promised these poor Irish guys, is like, hey, you want to be a navigator on a canal? And that's what they called them, navigators. And they were digging the thing by hand. So at first it was this really undercapitalized project. And then they got foreign financing. So a lot of foreign money came into building these canals and then into the railroads. And of course, the land grant system was that, well, basically you get the land and you find the money to build it. There was some money raised for the Transcontinental Railroad. Again, it was mostly bonds, but there was a lot of foreign investment.
John, with 19 books, now to your credit, what's number 20 going to be about?
Well, David, I'm hoping it's going to be about bringing the environment to every neighborhood in the country. Climate change is, of course, our existential threat. And it's sort of what I call a reverse Walden, where we'll look, well, how do we enjoy nature in suburbia in the middle of a city? And what does that mean? How do we produce our own energy? How do we clean our air and our water and stuff like that? And how do you localize it? You know, one of the things that I really discuss in the book is that, climate change affects everything. And it certainly affects our way of looking at infrastructure. We have to build bridges higher. We have to redesign our water systems. I mean, everything. So this book would look at, well, how do we kind of shrink this question down, break it down a little bit. It's like, what does it mean for my neighborhood? So that hopefully will be my next book, and I would call it The Natural Neighborhood.
I have one or two more, I guess. Would Lincoln have embraced the concept of public-private partnerships? I'm just thinking of the pandemic, for example, with the cooperation of the federal government and the pharmaceutical companies. Is there any analogies back in that era of public-private partnerships?
I think so. So, when a lot of these projects were done, what really provide an undergirding of the financial structure of them was the fact that they were able to solicit Eastern and European investors. So, the most the federal government could do, because it owned most of the land that had been appropriated from Native Americans, and they could say, look, we'll give you the land. Maybe the states can help a little bit with floating some bonds, but it won't be enough. It's never enough. And you're going to have to find the rest of the money to do this. And that was certainly the story with, all the railroads, all the railroads that came after the Transcontinental Railroad, the local systems. And there was one side story, this originally a journalist named Henry Villard had started out his career covering the Civil War, created the first newspaper syndicate, and became a friend of Lincoln. But he eventually got so much information on some of these railroad projects going out west that he became an investor and a financier. There's the famous Villard House in Manhattan. That was Henry Villard. Of course, he lost a lot of that fortune. Railroad stocks crashed. They went up and down. But he eventually financed Thomas Edison. So that's another great story. But he would go back to German investors, because he was originally from Germany, and say, hey, look, this railroad you're financing in Kansas City, you might want to take another look at the paper and the statements, and I can help you with this. And he made huge brokerage fees, and then he got stock, and then he became filthy rich. But the Villard House is still there, and his history is just probably as interesting as anybody else from that Gilded Era.
So, John, for our final question before we close, you've been to so many Lincoln tourist destinations. Which is your favorite?
Oh gosh, David, that's a tough one. It's like picking your favorite child. That's not fair. Come on. The thing that really strikes me, and this is not something that most people even associate with Lincoln, is a place called Lincoln Landing. It's in Lockport, Illinois, and Lincoln actually, it's one of those things where Lincoln came through there, after his only term in Congress, and that's really what spurred my imagination and thinking. Was like, how did Lincoln see the future of the country? He helped get this canal built. It created a great city and all the towns along it. you know, and you think of all the towns along the Erie Canal in New York City and New Orleans and all the things that happened after it. But he had this vision, and sometimes places have this power to really instill this vision in you. And, you know, you try to get into Lincoln's head, and you know, all of us have tried, and we don't completely understand him. We never will. But it's important to see what he saw and to feel maybe what he felt, and to know that to aspire to a better country was still a worthy goal and a moral principle that we can't abandon.
Well, John, on behalf of the Gabelli School, the CFA, it is wonderful to again have you back. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. We've got great programs again coming up with several Wall Street legends, including Peter Cohn and Dr. Henry Kaufman. So on behalf of all of us again, John, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And I just hope and pray that we'll get back to a healthy, healing country again. And I'll be back in New York City with my friends, and I miss you all terribly. But I wish everybody the best.
Thanks again.